Hello and welcome everybody to this webinar on the Black LGBTQ Community Survey. We completed the survey just a couple months ago in collaboration with the Center for Black Equity. The sponsors and partners were the AARP, Freddie Mac, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, and the Wilson Media Group. We are thrilled at the timing of this because there's never been a more important time to talk about this topic. And we have a panel of experts to facilitate discussion about this important topic from their own personal perspectives as well as their professional viewpoints. Next, Dave. I'm Tom Roth. I'm the founder and president of Community Marketing and Insights. But before we get started, I want to introduce Earl Folks, who is the CEO of the Center for Black Equity, who commissioned the study to share with us why this study is important at this time. Earl, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
All good.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. The Center for Black Equity is a 22-year-old organization. It's a Black, queer, LGBTQ plus, same gender loving organization. And basically, we're a membership organization. We have 43 members throughout the United States, 10 abroad, and we facilitate our mission, which is to promote a multinational LGBTQ plus network dedicated to improving health and wellness opportunities, economic empowerment, and equal rights, while promoting individual and collective work, responsibility, and self-determination. And we execute our mission by mostly through Black Prides. Events which have been taking place for the last 31 years. Last year, we didn't have Black Pride because of COVID-19. And my team, we decided that we're going to take advantage of this kind of lull in our activities by using CMI, who we were partnered with before about 7 years ago, to commission a survey, a detailed survey to garner information that we can use, I should say just we, the community can use to work with issues around the Black LGBTQ experience. And CMI did an excellent job, as they always do. And and as you will find out, for those of you who have not seen the report, that this is a robust survey, has lots of information, and gives us an insight on some of the issues that our Black LGBTQ members are going through at this time.
Let me introduce a little bit about Community Marketing Insights. We started in 1992. Our practice includes a full spectrum of research, but with an entirely LGBTQ focus. So we produce surveys, focus groups, interviews, and we base our research on our own panel of 50,000 LGBTQ community representative, I should say, LGBTQ research participants. But we also always work in partnership with the community. So that expands the reach, it expands the diversity representation, and it improves the results of the studies that we engage in. We are an NGLCC certified LGBT owned business enterprise. So let's let each of the panelists say a few words about themselves and introduce the organizations that they're representing. Why don't we start with you, Cassandra?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Cassandra Cantave. I work for AARP. I'm a senior research advisor, and I focus primarily on the LGBTQ work. Been there for about 18 years, and we are definitely really working hard to show up as an ally for the LGBTQ community.
And Nicole?
Hi, everybody. My name is Nicole Cozier. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Human Rights Campaign. And the Human Rights Campaign is the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in the country, and we've been working really hard to secure equity and equality for LGBTQ people around the country and assist in places we can globally, but also really trying to expand and ensure that our rights as an LGBTQ community includes all of the most marginalized within our community and at all of the intersections of our identities. So it's
fantastic. Thank you. Yep. Earl, you talk to us a little bit about the Center for Black Equity. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm the president CEO of the Center for Black Equity. My social activism comes from HIV/AIDS. I started working around HIV/AIDS issues around 30 years ago, and has morphed to political involvement and really looking at those factors that contribute to the lack of health and social and economic equity among communities of color. And so I've been doing this work for a long time. It's a pleasure to be with such esteemed colleagues, as always.
Yep, I agree. Thank you. And Nii-Quartelai?
Good afternoon, Thomas. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai Quartey. Until recently, I served as Senior Advisor and National LGBTQ Liaison for AARP. These days, I'm on special assignment as our Multicultural Engagement Lead for our COVID-19 Vaccine Education Campaign, which is inclusive of our LGBTQ work. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to take all the wonderful research insights and relationships from really advancing our LGBTQ work and to really integrate them into our #1 priority, which is our COVID vaccine education campaign. Before joining AARP, I've done a lot of work in the policy advocacy space with the American Heart Association and ran a political affairs firm in Los Angeles. And I am a big champion of saying no data, no justice. I think what CMI does, what we've been able to do together with the Human Rights Campaign and the Center for Black Equity and Freddie Mac is generate some insights that are actionable, that help us all to go beyond a particular hashtag or slogan, and do the work of making Black lives matter through a radically inclusive lens. So really delighted to be here with you today, and delighted to learn and share all the wonderful insights gleaned.
Thank you very much. And Nii-Quartelai will be our MC and Q&A master today. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is David Paisley, and I'm the Senior Research Director here at CMI. I've actually been with the company now for over 20 years. And I've coordinated the research projects for the company, and I've really coordinated just hundreds and hundreds of research projects for corporations, for universities, for nonprofits and governments. And it's been a really great experience over that time.
And I will second that. I'm motivated to get out of bed every morning because research is such a fantastic way to learn, and passionate, of course, about our community and understanding it from every perspective. When we started the company in 1992, we had no idea where we would be going with it. I think that research has really opened a lot of doors for corporate America, for nonprofits and NGOs, for universities, and for the government. And we're really proud to be part of that conversation all these years. All right, are we taking it over now with you introducing the research, Dave?
All right, so maybe Nii-Quartelai, you can just talk a little bit, introduce that so much yourself because you just did that, but what your role here is sort of the MC and Q&A and how that's all going to work. You might be on mute, Nii-Quartelai.
Here I am, have no fear. Thanks again, Tom and David, for your leadership on this and your leadership over the years. AARP was really pleased to work with CMI some years ago when we launched what has become our landmark LGBTQ research study, Maintaining Dignity. And so I'm just so glad we could continue to work together and provide some value to the community. So with that, I want to say hello again and remind everyone that I'm going to be reviewing the Q&A and really just sort of keeping track of the questions that come up and doing as best I can to pepper in your questions to the conversation as naturally as possible, so we don't have to save questions to the very end. The format of this talk is really simple. Dave from CMI, he's going to present some of the findings of the research by slides. And the panel is going to give some really practical insights into the meaning of the results. Cassandra, Earl, and Nicole have very complementary vantage points, and their knowledge of the movement, the work of their respective organizations are really going to allow for us to delve into some really rich, not just rich insights, but some rich context to help us move forward. And, you know, we are well aware that, you know, this is a mixed audience. This is not an audience of just policy wonks or just corporate leaders or nonprofit leaders, but it is an audience of folks. You are an audience of folks that are have devoted your careers and have channeled your activism towards creating change. And so go ahead and sit back and take out your notebook and know that no matter what vantage point you have in the movement, whatever vantage point you have in community, we have something for you. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Dave to begin to walk us through the presentation.
Great. And I'm going to spend minimal time talking, but I just want to go over the results slide by slide. And first, I'll start with the research methodology. So a little bit about the study. First of all, I want to say that this is just sort of a sampling of the results. There's a full 72-page report online for free that anyone can download, so feel free to do that. This will be probably going over less than half of the results of the overall study. In total, we had over 1,800 Black LGBT adults in the United States take the 15-minute survey. As Tom said, we often partner with other community organizations. In this case, about half of the response came from our own panel at CMI, but the other half came from the different media partners. And I'll show you that list of the media partners that we worked with. And also to say that 56% of the participants reported being fully out, with 44% being at different stages being out. Just to acknowledge that people who are not out at all in the Black LGBTQ community are sort of unlikely to take a survey like this. So this does represent sort of more of people that are Black LGBTQ community members in the United States that are sort of out and interactive with either an LGBTQ panel or LGBTQ organizations or Black LGBTQ media. So we need to acknowledge that. It's probably not fully representative of the entire community. It's more representative of the community that's sort of out and active within our community. And also to say that we did have some weighting and segmentation. I'm not going to bore you with weighting and segmentation by age and gender identity, but if you go into the full report, it does describe that more fully. And a big thank you to the different organizations that helped get this survey out into the Black LGBTQ community. As I said, over 50% of the responses are not part of our panel. They are readers and members of these different organizations. Here's an example of many of the different media that helped us get the survey out. And here are the example of the many Black prides and different organizations connected to the Center of Black Equity that actually got this survey out. So again, a big thank you. I think it was over 60 organizations and media that distributed this survey. So couldn't have happened without them. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit. My role is to just present sort of factually some of the findings, and I'm going to turn it over to the panel to sort of really interpret the findings I'm talking about. And the first one I think is an interesting question. We asked, first of all, really early in the survey, do you connect more with the Black community, the LGBTQ community, both communities, or maybe neither? And I think what's interesting about the results is it was a little bit all over the place. As you can see on the left hand for the all Black LGBTQ result, it's pretty evenly divided. And as Earl mentioned earlier, we did this same question 7 years ago, and we got very similar results, actually. Actually, they were very similar over the 7-year spread. So I'm going to start with that. How does the panel react to this about sort of this sort of distribution that you're seeing here?
So I would say, I think what I find interesting actually is the percentage that say they don't have a connection with either community, so 10%, that was actually kind of striking to me. But when I look at this and when I think about it, I think about oftentimes you hear about a lot of Black LGBTQ folks feel like in certain settings, they have to choose one or the other. Either I have to be Black or I have to be LGBTQ identified. And, oftentimes it's a struggle There are a lot of, external components, social components that make people feel like they have to choose. And I know one of the other findings was that, sometimes Black LGBTQ folks do not feel that they identify with LGBTQ organizations. And I think, again, our experiences are unique, they're different, especially, from the AARP lens, when you think about older LGBTQ folks that, went through that whole civil rights era. It's complicated. And I think, those are some of the things that I think of when I look at this chart.
What it does for me is that it reaffirms why Black Pride exists, because Black Pride creates a space for Black queer folks who don't have to choose between being Black and LGBTQ+. So there's a safe space for them so they can be authentically who they are. And that's why we keep having more every year. More and more Black Prides keep coming on to the into the organization, because people feel the need to celebrate both parts of who they are and acknowledge both parts of who they are.
Okay, great. And I'm going to go on in a couple other questions. We asked some questions like, do you feel pride in being an LGBTQ person? And the vast majority said they agreed and definitely agreed. And again, these are people who are interacting with the LGBT and Black LGBT media organizations, so that makes sense. But I think some of the questions below that are really interesting. And the first one, and it got truncated, unfortunately, here on the screen for some reason, but it says, as an LGBT person, I can be myself in my neighborhood. And that's the second one. I'm not sure why that happened, but only 47% definitely agreed with that. So Earl, I know we talked about this before. Why do you think relatively few are saying that they fully agree that they can be themselves in their neighborhood?
Because the majority of Black LGBTQ members of the community live in Black neighborhoods. And unfortunately, there is a great deal of homophobia within the Black community that has not been dealt with appropriately, and people don't feel safe at home. And they don't always feel safe going to the neighborhood because of the race issues. And so they're kind of stuck in between two communities that they don't quite feel comfortable in.
Mm-hmm. All right, and the one on the bottom here, again, Cassandra sort of alluded to this, and I'm sorry for the cutoff there, but it says, I feel connected to LGBTQ social and political organizations. And that was a really striking one. I mean, only 29% definitely agreed with that. And I'm actually curious, starting off with the HRC Foundation, Nicole, what are you doing at HRC to really make sure that you're connecting with the Black LGBT community and representing the needs there?
Yeah. I think one of the things that becomes a challenge is when we're doing broad-based sort of legislative work or political work, it can be hard to see how the relevance of something that is sort of a broad-scale political piece of legislation has on the impact of our very real lived lives and lived experience. And so, I will say that HRC has been doing work for a long time that has an impact on Black LGBTQ community, but I think it has not been as visible, it has not been as centralized, and it has not been as explicit as it has been over the last several years. And that is in part been because of a critical drive, I think, on the part of Alfonso David, our new, our organization's leadership, and the work that we're doing to really work at the intersections of LGBTQ experience, and recognizing that our experience looks very different depending on what other intersecting identities come to bear on that. So when you look at our work organizationally, we're looking at ways that we can lean in very specifically around issues that have specific impact, in whether it's our HIV and health equity work, whether it's our HBCU work, whether it's our work with foster and adoptive care work, whether it's the work that we're doing in our new litigation work, and in the cases that get taken up in that litigation work. So, we made an explicit decision and made an explicit statement in September 2019 to release a racial equity and inclusion statement that said that we recognize that we must hold racial equity and inclusion as central to the work that we're doing. And I think you'll see that showing up in the way, in the types of work that we're doing, in the ways that we're driving that work, and not just in work that is specifically at the intersections of LGBTQ and Black identity, but the ways that we're leaning in on issues that affect the Black community and in fact affect LGBTQ people as a result. And a big part of that has been in the partnerships that we are engaging with our community colleagues, like Center for Black Equity, NAACP, a number of organizations that we are working with in collaboration. So I think there are a number of ways that we're leaning into the work. Part of the question is, I think, in our work and challenges, how are we making sure that people know that we are doing this work, that people who are in the community and most affected, and the people who are taking this survey can see themselves reflected in the work that's happening.
Hey, David, can I just add, and we're starting to get some questions into the chat that I want to weave in, but I just want to lift up a point that Nicole just made. And, you know, it's important to point out the importance of symbolism and substance. Symbolism and substance. Nicole just mentioned Alphonso David, the first Black president of Human Rights Campaign, right? Earl Folks, president of the Center for Black Equity. David Johns, executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. We have leadership at the task force, leadership at the National Center of Lesbian Rights. That's never happened before, where 5 sort of legacy organizations in our communities, happen to be led by Black LGBTQ people. And so I suspect that may be a part of the equation. I think the more that folks are able to see demonstrations of what it can look like to lead, what it can look like to be both Black, unapologetically Black, and unapologetically LGBTQ, I think that goes a long way in terms of folks being able to lean into their identities more seamlessly. I also see in the chat, there's some questions that came up. One of them was related to a point that Earl had made about the Black community being more homophobic than the white community. And Reginald asked the question, is that perception reality?
Well, first of all, I never said there was more. I never made the comparison between the two communities. I said there was a perception, and that's partly reality and partly perception. But for many of our transgender, non-binary people who are African-American, live in African-American neighborhoods, they have expressed concern about their health and welfare. I'm not saying I'm not in the position to compare the level of homophobia in different communities, but I do know that most Black LGBT folks live in Black neighborhoods and they don't feel safe, and they've expressed this time and time again. And so, I think that my concern, and my organization, we're concerned about creating safe spaces in Black neighborhoods, and safe spaces for non-binary and transgender men and women. And so let me say this, I don't believe that Black folks are more homophobic than anyone else. I just know that the reality for people who are living in these neighborhoods who feel vulnerable, that they're not safe.
Thank you for that, Earl. And I also see in the chat, and perhaps Nicole, you can share some insights related to this. Billy said in his experience, the most visible community part of the LGBTQ organizations are their fundraising events, which have a tendency to be very white, gay, and male. Nicole, Earl, maybe you can talk a little bit more about efforts to diversify the donor base and diversifying boards. All of those things play a role in terms of how you're able to sort of guide the organization and ultimately make the organization more reflective of the communities we serve.
Yeah, also, I know that is part of the sort of the legacy of HRC that we're really trying to get out from under, and that, the organization is 40 years old. And there are some long persistent perceptions of the organization that are valid in terms of where we have been in the past, but are not necessarily a reflection of where we are currently and the work that we're doing. And I do think a big piece of this is people come to organizations where they see themselves reflected. And so we're doing a lot of work and a lot of direct outreach into communities to not only say, here we are, we'd love to, we want to be engaged in the full breadth and rich diversity within our community, but also to do that, we have to demonstrate, and I think we're really leaning in on demonstrating that the issues that we're driving, the work that we're doing has relevance to the lived experience of our Black queer community and our Black trans community. And a lot of the work, and we've seen a shift in that. And we've honestly seen a shift in some of our base, where some of those old guard who felt like, you know, their issues were not being reflected to the same extent that they had, you know, would ideally like to see in the past, and they've fallen away, and that's okay. Because the people who are here and the people who are part of this organization and the people we're trying to attract are those who recognize where we are today, where we're going, the work that is really important to who we are, and that we need to be in this together, and we want to be in this together. And so, you know, I think that some of that perception will fall away as we continue to show up in the way that we're showing up. And we're really committed to doing that and making sure that in this particular case, that Black LGBTQ community really does see themselves reflected in the priorities of the work that HRC is driving.
And Cassandra, I actually want to give you an opportunity, actually, because, you know, AARP talks or works with a broad base of people, the general population, but you're also working with older Americans who are Black and LGBTQ. But how is AARP responding to the overall Black community?
Well, AARP actually definitely comes to everything from a multicultural lens. So it is not the responsibility of just the multicultural team to do work in the African-American community. It's the responsibility of everybody throughout the enterprise. So there are a lot of different ways, little strategies. One, showing up where people are. You know, we fully understand that you cannot just reach Black folks in church, because you'll never find me there, you know. But, you know, I joke, but seriously, you have to meet people where they are. I think, you know, we are taking this opportunity definitely to really understand that, you know, when we talk about the Black community, it's not a Black community, it's Black communities. And so we have to take into account Afro-Latinos, you have to take into account Caribbean folks, Indigenous people, biracial people that identify as Blacks, you know, just the whole view. And, you know, be careful not to make one engagement fit all, because we are not a monolithic group. Even our LGBTQ work, back in 2016, we did our member opinion survey, which is AARP's largest survey. And, you know, 900,000, maybe a little bit more than 900,000 of our members identified as LGBTQ. And so, you know, that cemented the fact that we needed to move forward with this work. And with Nii-Quartelai as national advisor, we make sure that everything is done through a multicultural lens. We have a Black community page, you know, and we make sure that our work is definitely very culturally sensitive, whether it's our policy work or our research work. You know, we definitely come from that lens. And the last thing I'll say is that we make sure that there's an understanding that, yes, AARP is an organization where our members are 50 plus, but the work that we do for everybody. And so we know that our audience are, you know, everybody from the civil rights icon, some pre-civil rights, right? All the way to the millennial, you know, Black kid that is taking care of his mom. And so, you know, we try to make sure that everything is very wide ranging.
And I think it's really interesting. When you think about paid membership lists, you may have the biggest paid LGBTQ membership list out there. And it's interesting to think that AARP has that and is tracking it. All right, I think we're going to move on, get through all these slides. We're going to have to pick up the pace here a little bit. So let me just acknowledge that on this slide, that most of the respondents who came from urban America, and that's not surprising because the Black LGBT or the Black community overrepresents in urban America. So about 67% came either from big or medium-sized urban cities. But what I think is interesting in these slides is we asked how supportive of its local LGBT community is the city or town in which you live in. How supportive is how supportive the local Black community is your location, and then how supportive is your city or town of its Black LGBTQ community. Now, I think what's interesting here, again, most of the people are coming from big cities. So it might be like San Francisco or Philadelphia or Chicago. But generally, the respondents felt that their local communities are more supportive of the LGBTQ community than their local Black community, and then the least responsive to the Black LGBT community, right? So I'm wondering what the response is for this.
You know, I think it's no surprise to anyone who's been looking out a window these days. Like, we have a real and prevailing and pervasive issue with racism that's still in our country, and that means within our within our LGBTQ communities, within our broader communities. And so for those who are sitting at the intersections of those two identities, I mean, you're getting hit. This is the crux of what intersectionality is, right? I mean, when Kimberly Crenshaw talked about intersectionality, she introduced the concept as it relates to Black women. But it is broadened and is so very related to the way that our LGBTQ communities are experiencing their identities and their realities. And so the question of, you know, what do people see first? How do people react first? Where are people exposed to LGBTQ folks? I think that, you know, almost every family can say that they probably have it within their network, somebody who's LGBTQ identified. We have a country that's structured very well where people can actually not engage with people of color and Black folks if they choose not to, in a lot of different ways. And so I think the thrust and the influences of racism are still so strong and so relevant in how people are experiencing their worlds at these intersections, even in urban communities, because we know we are not immune in urban communities to the impact of racism in very real ways.
But at the same time, Earl, the least support for the Black LGBTQ community, and I'm sure that's something you've seen also.
Well, you know, this interesting is that having been to one of the things that doing Black Pride and working for the Center for Black Equity has done is allowed me to visit many, many, many communities. I've been to more places than you can shake a stick, and then many of them are medium-sized cities, and particularly in the South. And it's interesting that, you know, our communities are segregated. They're racially segregated throughout the United States. There's more probably racial segregation in housing now than there was in the 50s. And the fact of the matter is that people feel whether you're Black or LGBTQ and you're living in a Black neighborhood, you're on the outside looking in. And while gentrification in the last few years, the last 10 years has taken over large and small and medium-sized cities, the people who live there who are straight and LGBTQ, who are Black, don't feel that are part of these wonderful changes that are happening in the urban areas. And they feel the racism as a Black person continues to hit them across the head, even though they may be different type of Black person, they're a queer Black person, they're still living in Black neighborhoods and suffering along their Black straight brothers and sisters with racism.
You know, David, just looking at that last slide there, you know, I want to put on the table an opportunity for us to consider the tension in consciousness between racial justice and LGBTQ justice. And so if I look at those numbers, that's sort of what comes to mind for me. You know, I think about the tension between equality and equity. And for, you know, a long time, our LGBTQ movement has had a pro-equality message, and rightfully so. We absolutely need to pass the Equality Act, among other things. But, you know, we have not been as forthright in the fight for equity. And it's part of what makes the executive order, you know, that Vice President Biden signed around equity, inclusive of LGBTQ, part of what made that such a big deal. But as I look through this, you know, I think, okay, that equity part of the equation, we've got to do some work, because if we don't do that work, then, you know, we potentially breathe life into sort of grievance politics, where it feels like LGBTQ folks are getting ahead, although some of them, you know, and, you know, certain racial groups, particularly Black folks, are not. And, you know, some people may remark about that now, but I still think there's plenty of opportunity for us to mount a more vigorous effort around building equity?
The next section, we're going to talk a little bit more about discrimination and particularly when people sort of, I don't know, look at their own personal experiences, and especially when we're really focusing on these questions over the past 3 years. We said, look back over the past 3 years, how much discrimination are you experiencing in these different ways? And I think what was important, and we talked about a little bit more, is that generally the participants were describing more discrimination around racial discrimination than sexual orientation discrimination. So I'm wondering, Nicole or Cassandra, to talk a little bit more about that from a day-to-day life.
I think it's I sort of responded to this a bit in the last question in terms of how we are navigating space and the intersections really of how we are recognizing that racial discrimination and marginalized identity and oppression actually is infused and is part of the experience of all of our marginalized groups. So if you are marginalized because of race, you can still discriminate based on other identities. When you're LGBTQ and marginalized because of that, you still can discriminate on the grounds of race and other identities. And I think that means that we have to really remind ourselves of the importance of kind of engagement and education around these things, regardless of where we are. And for me, the work around racial equity in particular, and thinking about how we're doing that work within the LGBTQ community is a big part of the work that I'm doing. And so it's not just while organizationally we're driving work externally within communities and programmatically on LGBTQ policy that is intersectional and that does reflect the realities, and we're doing that more and more, of the most marginalized within our LGBTQ community. My work is also about how we're using opportunities to engage with LGBTQ community to lift up and recognize the places that racism is really prevalent within our marginalized group, and not let people lose sight of that. And I think that the work that other folks are doing, the work of David Johns and Earl folks and other folks who are doing work within communities or at the nexus of LGBTQ and Black communities, are also doing really critical work in how we're lifting those pieces up, not only creating safe spaces for Black and queer folks, but also educating Black community about the importance of equity, equality, and engaging and embracing the struggle of our communities. And when we look across the board and where we are, the epidemic of violence against Black trans women is something that all of our communities have to really be not just aware of, but incensed by and do something about, because these are folks who are at the epicenter of our communities. They are at the epicenter of oppression. They are at the epicenter of all of the ways that we are manifesting the worst of our oppression. And as long as that's allowed to happen, and as long as we are not equally invested, our LGBTQ community is not invested, our Black community is not invested, our communities at large are not invested, that to me is the evidence of sort of what we are willing to tolerate is really what our investment is in eradicating, in actually our quest for liberation and our quest for equity on our way to equality, because we cannot get to equality if we're not addressing equities and inequities.
And one thing I want to point out is that for the participants, they may have seen more racial discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination, but for our transgender and non-binary participants, the level of discrimination in this research that they were experiencing was higher than racial discrimination or sexual orientation discrimination. So getting back to what Nicole was saying, is that by far in every question around discrimination, it was the transgender and gender non-binary participants that were expressing by far the highest level of discrimination on all aspects, every question.
Indeed. I was actually going to jump in, and, I think Nicole definitely hit the nail on the head with everything, that she mentioned. Over the past 3 years, we've just seen almost just a blatantness in racial discrimination, across the US. One of the things for us at AARP, is to make sure that we stop otherizing, right? So when we're doing our research, especially when it's so easy when you're doing research or policy work to say, okay, you know what, I'm going to tackle the L and the G, and then I'm going to just put everybody else in this other box, but really to start looking at transgender and non-binary issues and their unique experiences and putting it out in the forefront, especially, you know, Black, trans, and non-binary, like Nicole said, you know, the violence against the communities is just, it's outrageous. You know, and then of course, in terms of age discrimination, one of the things that we know at AARP is that age discrimination is probably the most, it is very prevalent, and it's also one of those that people cast aside. It's like, oh, that's not really that's not really discrimination, but that too, you know, is oppressive, especially to LGBTQ folks.
And one thing I want to point out about this chart is that we often think about discrimination in terms of maybe workplace discrimination or, you know, maybe housing discrimination. But to point out is that the place where people are seeing the most discrimination is just everyday life, being a customer at a store or being in a bar or a restaurant. I mean, that's just everyday discrimination is draining for anyone, right? I also want to point out that discrimination also exists within the LGBTQ community. And we've said, look back over the last 3 years, have you experienced racial discrimination or prejudice from within our community? And a good number of people said yes, especially in the realm of dating and romantic and sexual partners, but also at things like at our nightclubs and bars and neighborhoods. And one thing I want to point out here is that although these numbers about experiencing discrimination in bars and nightclubs and neighborhoods, the actual reality is much higher, because I mean, a lot of our participants may not even have these kind of resources in the place that they live, but those that do probably live in bigger cities are experiencing it. So Earl, maybe this is a good place for you to talk a little bit about discrimination from within our community.
You know, it's a very it's a very interesting point that you make. And I wanted to get back to when you look at romantic discrimination among romantic and sexual partners. I think that it's a thin line between preference. You know, if I want to, if I'm on one of those social websites, and I put down that I'm looking for a blue-haired, blonde, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, 6'2" tall guy, as opposed to saying, I don't want no Blacks, no Latinos, no Asians. I think it's a thin line. And I think that's where people are running into the discrimination, is because people are saying it's not what they want, it's not what they don't want. And what they don't want usually are people of color. And you feel, and I don't go into these websites, but I talk to people who do, and it's crushing. Every day is like no Blacks, no Asians, no Latinos. And I think that what happens is our community, we need to educate ourselves about how we talk to each other, how we express ourselves to one another, and how we are sensitive to each other's where we are, as opposed to just looking through a single lens. If you're LGBTQ, we're all the same. We're not all the same.
And I also want to point out that the highest level of discrimination, again, that we see within the community is that the transgender and non-binary participants are reporting an awful lot of discrimination from within our community. And Nicole, actually, maybe you're best to respond to that. How do we change that dynamic within our community?
Well, I think one of the ways that we do that is we have to start lifting up more positive stories about trans and non-binary folks in our community. I think so often all of the stories that we hear are victim narratives that really paint a very real and lived experience that we have to address, but a one-dimensional experience of who our trans and non-binary community members are, right? And I think until we, one, start humanizing our trans and non-binary community more, lifting up the stories and the places where they are living and vibrant and contributing and driving and leading and all of the things that are just so incredibly wonderful and irreplaceable about each of us, right? Then we can't we can't then say, hey, look at this one very singular manifestation of this community. Now figure out how this works, particularly when folks may not have any other experience with trans and non-binary folks that they know of other than these narratives. It really helps reinforce tropes. And so I think it's a fine line we walk between lifting up the importance of and the discrimination and oppression that we have to address, particularly against our trans and non-binary community members, and also celebrating and reveling in the contributions and all of the wonderful ways that they are and have been in our history, within our movement, within, you know, until like the beginnings of time. We have to start sharing those examples, because otherwise people think about folks in not only narrow ways, but like this is a new thing, right? Like that this didn't happen before and that folks didn't exist. Trans and non-binary folks are newly part of our community, and they have always been part of our community. And so I think that's a really important piece, is some of the storytelling, some of the exposure, and some of the recognition, quite frankly, that trans and non-binary people care about a lot of things that are not just about their own lived experience, but they have to focus so much on their lived experience uniquely because other people aren't. So how do we also recognize the ways that trans and non-binary folks are really engaged in driving other aspects of our communities and our societies that benefit all of us? So I think those are some of the ways that we really have to think about changing the way that we're talking about engaging, viewing, and lifting up the visibility of our trans and non-binary communities.
And if I could say one of the things that disturbs me the most is that the trans and non-binary participants, they were doubled the numbers for when they felt that they were having problems with the nonprofit, LGBTQ nonprofit serving our community. I think we need to look at people in the more human aspects as opposed to statistics and what we know by watching television. And I think that LGBTQ organizations, especially nonprofits in our communities, have to be more sensitive to transgender and non-binary clients. They just have to be sensitive. And this number is really sad that our own community treats our people badly.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe we discussed it earlier, but the number of Black LGBTQ folks that didn't feel comfortable within LGBTQ organizations. And I think, you know, everything that you and Nicole mentioned, but also just making sure that we're consistently being inclusive, consistently learning, consistently shining the light on, you know, the entire community, not just, you know, the first few letters. I think that is, you know, of utmost importance.
We're going to talk a little bit about, we asked a question, have you participated in the following Black Lives Matters related protests and activities in the past 12 months? And we see pretty high engagement across the board, a little bit higher with millennials and older generations. But I think what's interesting here is it was pretty well across the board, really across all generations. So, you know, I'm just wondering, we throw this out here, how have your organizations participated in the Black Lives Matter protests and engagements?
Well, I can say for the Center for Black Equity, we have 43 members, and we did a poll of our 43 members, and almost 90% of them participated in Black Lives Matter activities in their communities in some form or fashion. Some took leadership positions, some handed out water during marches, some marched, some demonstrated, some protested, but we're very pleased to see that these organizations, these nascent community-based organizations serving the LGBTQ communities of color, especially African-American Blacks, were really quietly doing their duty and understanding that they have to be very careful as nonprofits how much you get involved so you don't lose your 501c3 certification from the Internal Revenue Service. You have to be careful what you say and what you do. And I was very proud of how they behaved and how they joined into this Black Lives Matter movement because we're Black. And they basically said, you know, no one's going to keep us from participating from these things because this is who we are and this is part of who we are. And that's very, it's very satisfying to watch that from a distance.
And now we're going to move on to some different topics, and we'll start with financial, home, and family. And we'll start off with education. And this is something that I think Earl and I have talked about quite a bit, but within the group of participants, 48% of the participants had a bachelor's degree or greater, and that's really quite high. But I think more importantly is that 84% of participants pursued some sort of post-high school education. Now that may have been community college or trade school or getting your BA or currently in school, but there seemed to be a real value in pursuing higher education amongst the participants. And Earl, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but so if you can express some of your feelings about why that is.
Well, you know, it's not surprising at all, because growing up, knowing I was different, I think that a lot of our members of the Black queer community are overachievers. We know that we have to do better than the average person on the street because of our color. We know we have to perform better than the average person on the street because of our sexual orientation or sexual identity. We know we have to do better to move ourselves up in our communities. And these are things that for me and for many people in my generation, we were taught. I remember when someone asked me when I decided to go to college, and I said, I never did. I was told I was going, and my choice was where I was going to go. And so that's how a lot of us, education is a gateway to liberation for many of us, and equity and equality. And this is not unusual. As you know, I'm not going to jump ahead, but you know, that's the good part. There's a negative part of it as well. But the good part is that, you know, many of us in our community, the overwhelming majority of us, value education and value the pathway to education is going to be a pathway to a better life.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that we also noticed in the research is that as you may see on the right-hand side, that the transgender and non-binary participants were the least likely to have a 4-year degree. And HRC, you know, had us run some additional numbers on this, which was really useful. And one thing that we really learned is that the transgender and non-binary participants were just as likely to have started the education, but not as likely to have finished. And that really struck me, is that we need probably more programs to provide the emotional and financial and practical support to make sure that all people in our community actually can achieve their educational goals. So I'm wondering, Nicole, if you have any comment about that.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, we have to think about what are some of the fundamental needs that that become barriers to education, right? I can't go to school if I don't know where I'm going to live. I can't go to school if I can't eat. How do I pay for my tuition when I can't get a job that's sustainable, or I can't get a job that allows me the time off to pursue my education? So there are a lot of things that are about sort of the fundamental ways that oppression and discrimination impacts trans and non-binary folks, that create huge obstacles to things like education, because folks can't even get access to basic human needs and human rights, right? So I think we have to think about what some of those things are. It's not a lack of drive, it's not a lack of interest, but you know, we keep throwing obstacles in the way and then wonder why folks don't succeed. And I think then when you overlay race on top of that, and sort of the history of racial oppression and obstacles and barriers to education and educational achievement, it just muddies, like makes the situation that much more complex. So I think we need to figure out what are some of the ways that we can clear some of those obstacles so that people who want to pursue education don't have to compromise or sacrifice their education to just be able to get up every morning.
And maybe, and I don't know, maybe a nonprofit out here is working on this within our community, but I think this is a whole program nonprofit that needs to exist, that there are so many people in the LGBT community that maybe want to have this 4-year degree or more, and they just have these practical obstacles, and there needs to be help, right?
And I just want to make one more plug, sorry, Earl. It's, I think, the importance of the data and understanding, because I think we get sort of cursory data and then we fill in the picture, we fill in the rest of the narrative and think we understand what's happening, and we don't. And so the more we can also do data, understand, listen, learn, and then take that and apply it to what are the solutions and the strategies that we're pursuing. But we can't have half the information and then drive strategies and expect that they're going to have the impact we want them to have. And also we need to have more trans and non-binary folks at the tables where the strategy decisions are made, where the data decisions are being made, and driving these narratives directly rather than by proxy.
And thank you, Nicole, that was a great point. And I just wanted to add, support systems, the transgender, non-binary members of our community are least likely to have support systems at home to support their going to college. And I think we can't underestimate just those little things, having someone make breakfast for you, or having lunch, or having transportation money to go on campus, or to have food when you're living on campus. We need to invest in support systems for these parts of our communities that don't have them. And that's expensive.
Absolutely. And then, you know what, there's some data in the report about LGBTQ identified folks that have experienced homelessness. And so, you know, it's kind of tied into what Nicole was saying. But so I teach a class at Georgia State, and I had a trans student, and one of his issues were, you know, I have these medical procedures, and, you know, and so you have this whole other component of, you know, as he's transitioning, some of the health issues that he may incur that keep him from coming to class. And so it's this whole mountain of challenges. And like Nicole said, we need trans people at the table, and we need to understand the whole story.
Yeah, and you know, to the point that Cassandra just made about understanding the whole story, I think it's just important to note here on this slide that, you know, sometimes we don't think about student loan debt or, you know, affordable community college as LGBTQ issues. But I think what this slide suggests is that for at least Black LGBTQ folks, and, you know, I would bet the LGBTQ community more broadly, you experience similar challenges when it comes to pursuit of education. And so I think it's important, as we think about our priorities moving forward, as we think about our advocacy for the companies that are listening in and that will watch this recording, as you think about your benefits for employees and how you're going to attract and retain LGBTQ employees, especially those rock star companies on the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index, you might want to consider some of the insights from this slide.
And the funny thing I'll say about this before I move on is that I think as an older person, I underappreciated before this year how crushing student loan debt is on people, on younger people today. And we certainly see this in this report, as you delve into the report, is that the student loan debt for young Black LGBTQ people is really quite crushing them right now. And it's something that needs to be fixed, not only for the Black community, but for all young people in America. A little bit about household income.
I was saying that I think it's crushing for older people also.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. A little bit about household income. You know, the participants' median 2019 household income was $59,000, which is lower than the average household income for the entire United States. It was actually higher than the median household income for all Black LGBT for Black adults who were not LGBTQ. So it was a little lower. Again, this is not really meant to be representative of the entire Black community or the Black LGBT community. But I think when you look at the education level of the participants and the urban locations where most of the participants were living, like in San Francisco or New York or Atlanta, what we really saw when we looked at these numbers is sort of suppressed income, quite frankly, is that there definitely seemed to be income discrimination. I know HRC does a lot of work around income discrimination, so maybe you have a comment there, Nicole?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, David?
Well, just the study really suggested that we're seeing suppressed income with Black LGBT community members given their education and urban locations in which they live. So I'm just wondering what you're seeing there at HRC about employment discrimination and the suppression of income.
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways that we're working on issues like these. But also I think where the intersections are occurring is really important too, and understanding where some of the major hits are coming from within each of affecting the community? Is it coming around racial discrimination? Is it coming around LGBTQ discrimination? Is it coming around gender discrimination? And I think all of those are still very real elements of suppressors in advancement, in salary, that we still have to address at large, because they are not siloed issues. And I think that's one of the things I would want to, as we're coming low on time, want to really reflect on, is that we have to stop looking at all of this as siloed sets of issues. We have to start talking about Black LGBTQ communities. We have to start talking about how the issues of gender and sexism and racism and homophobia and transphobia and all of those actually do harm to all of us in different ways. And quite frankly, when our communities are oppressed, we sometimes don't even know where it's coming from, right? Which aspects of our marginalized identities are the ones that are the driving forces. And so we have to stop looking at them in those kind of segmented tranches, even though I know sometimes that's the way it defaults, because we have to get some information. But I think we just have a general sense of really trying to figure out what some of the obstacles are in more depth. What are the stories behind the data? What are the experiences? And one of the things that we've done, particularly through COVID, the last year of COVID, is doing more research to understand what's the economic impact of COVID and the economic downturn on LGBTQ communities, and at different intersections as well, and trying to gather more information and learn more in ways that we can not only share, but also drive our own strategies.
Yeah. We have about 30 more minutes that we're going to talk. The webinar was scheduled for about 90 minutes. We're going to cover a bunch of more topics as we go through here. But I also want to talk about this as like being out in the family. We said, like, given your LGBT identity, how accepted you feel by these different generations? And this is probably true of all ethnicities, but we definitely saw it for the Black LGBTQ participants. Is just their acceptance was somewhat age related. So their siblings, like brothers and sisters, were much more accepting of their sexual orientation or gender identity than parents were, than their grandparents are, right? And I'm sure we would see this amongst the Latinx and white community too, but it is interesting and something to note that we do have these generational differences within the Black community. All right, and I also want to talk a little bit about LGBTQ parents. There are many LGBTQ parents out there within the Black LGBTQ community. It does tend to be more within the lesbian and bisexual women's community than the men's community, although transgender and non-binary participants have a quite high parent rate. And I'm wondering if anyone's working with LGBTQ parents out there in the different organizations, and some of maybe the some of the unique obstacles that may be facing LGBTQ Black parents.
I'll say that we're doing some different work within communities as well at HRC, and particularly in the foster and adoptive care communities. We have a Parents for Transgender Equality Council, so folks who are parents of transgender and non-binary kids, and navigating sort of the landscape for their kids. So they're both the avenues of what it's like to be LGBTQ or Black and LGBTQ and a parent, and what are the obstacles or challenges that we experience that way, but also what does it mean to be parents and helping our kids navigate their experience of their LGBTQ identity. As for me, I didn't come out until I was in my 20s. And so what did that look like, and sort of what difference would it have made for our youth to have parents who are supportive and affirming and helping them be able to be authentic in their own lived experience becomes really critical, because then I think that also shapes pathways and opportunities and the confidence that's critical for us to move through the world and claim our spaces in success and authenticity as well.
We also see a lot of LGBTQ baby boomer grandparents, which I think is really great to see out there. And getting back to, again, providing resources, 54% of the Black LGBTQ millennials want to be parents at some point in the future. So how do we create programs to help them make that happen? right? And that's something I'm sure some organizations are working on in the parents nonprofits.
Yeah, David, can I just add, that the point that you made about 23% of baby boomers, and when we look at sort of older adults and how they score in the survey, I think sometimes, that's a surprising figure, at least when Cassandra and I are out and about and we're talking about some of the insights that we've gleaned at AARP. A lot of folks just sort of assume or they write off older adults, right? That, they're just going to be too homophobic to engage. And so when they see insights like this, they're like, oh, wow, there are windows of opportunity. And hopefully the folks that are watching this and will watch this walk away knowing, wow, there's some opportunity to engage older adults, and we shouldn't just, write off, a huge segment of our communities, because of anecdotal experiences, or just this belief that, all older adults, all seniors, all grandparents are not going to be LGBTQ affirming.
Sure.
I was going to just piggyback on that. On that note, in 2018, we did a grandparenting study. And one of the questions that we asked was, if your grandchild came out as being LGBTQ, would you be accepting? And I think it was something like 90% that said yes, which again drives to the point that Nii-Quartelai was saying, is that, don't count all of them out, don't put them all in the bucket of being homophobic or unaccepting, and know that, I think, it's what we've been reiterating over and over again, right? Education, representation, letting people know that, if you don't understand X, then ask and learn, and it opens people's minds.
Sure.
And also, if you consider that there are many older people who are raising their grandchildren. Mm-hmm. So they have to be a little bit more savvy what's going on to do that.
Sure. A little bit about homeownership and homelessness. It was brought up before. And this is actually something I know quite a bit about, but what we found in the research is that a third of the Black LGBTQ participants own their home in which they live. But that percentage is really much lower than the 65% of all Americans who own their home and the 42% of just Black Americans that own their home. And we do a lot of work with Freddie Mac, and what you may or may not know is that LGBTQ people are far less likely to own a home than the general population. And there's a lot of reasons around that. Some have to do with discrimination, some have to do with a lot of other demographic factors, and that's maybe another story. But it is true, what we found here is that there's a really sort of a suppression of Black LGBT participants that own their own home. There's a lot of fear of discrimination. So over half of the Black participants fear racial discrimination when buying their home, and that was higher than the fear of sexual orientation discrimination. And clearly, racial discrimination was really the top fear they have in that home buying process. And one other thing that I think Cassandra brought up is that an awful lot, this was surprising to us, 31% of the participants said they experienced homelessness in their life. And when I saw that statistic, that really surprised me. But then at the same time, I thought, well, this is, have you ever experienced homelessness? And for me, myself, I think a lot of people of our age or my age, when I came out, I got thrown out of the house. I was homeless for a few days, way back 40 years ago or wherever it was. And I think that experience happens to a lot of LGBTQ people. It probably happens even more to transgender and non-binary people. And it's something that we have to appreciate, is that there has been a lot of homelessness in our life, and there will continue to be a lot of homelessness within the LGBTQ community.
Hey, David, one of the things that I noted also a couple of slides back when we talked about student loan debt. Like, we know student loan debt is very pervasive in the Black community and the Black LGBTQ community. And Nicole also talked about, some income disparities. We all know the 13%, less income, for Black folks compared to their white counterparts. And I think when you look at the total picture, right? So if you're coming out of school and you've got all the student loan debt, you're not being paid enough to actually take care of, what Sally Mae, maybe I shouldn't have said Sally Mae, but, but, pay what you're supposed to on your student loan, then you're already behind the 8 ball. And so for a lot of LGBTQ Black folks, and I don't have the data in front of me, but you're behind the 8 ball. And so you're living life really, credit cards, loans, trying to just maintain your basic needs. And so it just continues to snowball and perpetuate, where wealth accumulation, sometimes can feel out of reach. And, that includes home ownership, so I think that's a piece of the puzzle also.
Especially in communities that have that have been gentrified, the cost of living in New York, buying an apartment in New York or even DC and especially in California, it's really prohibitive for many folks. It's gentrification has driven a lot of our people almost into poverty levels.
Yeah, I was just going to echo the same thing, Earl, because when you think about where folks are looking to find community and able to live authentically and find acceptance, it tends to be in larger cities, larger urban areas where the cost of living is incredibly high. And so the idea of being able to be in those communities and afford a home is just, a much higher obstacle than being in other locations where the cost of living may be lower, home ownership obstacles to home ownership and opportunities for home ownership may be more attainable. But what are you trading off in terms of a sense of community, a sense of acceptance, being able to live authentically, et cetera?
That's correct.
A little bit, I'll have Cassandra respond to this one, but fear of discrimination and assisted living. So we asked, when you think of potential of sometime in the future, moving into an assisted living situation when you're older, this is one place where the fear of racial discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination and gender identity discrimination were more equal, right? So we have a lot of fear of this concept of getting older and maybe move into an assisted living situation. I'm wondering, Cassandra, how do we work through this fear and making these facilities safer places for LGBTQ people?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we know just overall from AARP research is that most older people really don't want to go to an assisted living facility. They want to live at home. They want to be able to stay within their communities, where they've grown up, where they feel safe. And so I'm really not surprised. And then when you think about, sexual orientation and gender identity, there's this fear of, I have to go back into the closet, or there are facilities that will not allow me to share a space with my spouse, right? Because, they're still under this archaic view that it has to be a man and a woman. And so I have to compromise. I have to really not be all of who I am, right? And so like I said, I'm not really surprised by these stats at all.
Do you think there's training happening in these assisted living facilities about LGBTQ issues? Is that something that's actually beginning to happen now?
I do believe that there is some training, and maybe Nii-Quartelai could talk a little bit more. I know that SAGE does a lot of work with this. We partner with SAGE often. And then on the other side of this is that, we do our OGC, our General Counsel Office, and our foundation does a lot of litigation work to ensure that people can be safe and live in dignity, in assisted living facilities.
Yeah, I think there's a program called Sage Cares, and they do tremendous work around training staff people in assisted living facilities and long-term care facilities, and organizations at large. I think there's also another organization somewhere in Kentucky that does something similar, and so that's critically important. I know the long-term care index that SAGE worked on along with Human Rights Campaign with some support from AARP Foundation. That is an incredible resource, especially in times like this, and especially considering statistics like this. We've also filed briefs in the U.S. Circuit Courts challenging discrimination in assisted living facilities. You all might be familiar with the Marshall Wetzel case that Lambda Legal led. We were proud to support that. And classic story of, a woman whose partner died, partner died after 30 years. The family comes in, takes the house, she goes live in an assisted living facility. She's talking about her family. Somebody, some bigoted person takes issue with that and actually physically assaults her over the course of many months in the assisted living facility. That story is too common. Passing the Equality Act is one thing we can do, and the long-term care index is another thing we can do, and socializing these insights is something that we can all do. But hopefully this gives folks that are streaming in a sense of just sort of how dynamic this challenge is, and how much more complicated it is for Black LGBTQ people that oftentimes are in religiously affiliated assisted living facilities. And that's a whole nother ball of wax right there. But thanks for raising it, yeah. David.
All right, as we begin to finish up here, as we have 15 minutes left, I want to alert people to some of the other information that really is available in this study. As I said, we're only going over for a portion of slides. We don't have time today to go over through everything, but I want to alert people that there is some good information within the report around religion and spiritual beliefs, and also political priorities. If you go through the report, you're going to see a lot about political views and where people sort of lie on the spectrum. Not surprisingly, most of the Black LGBT community trends liberal, but quite a few are trending at least somewhat moderate. We have a lot in there about voter priorities and the different activities that happened and political activities. I also want to say through health, there's a lot of health-based information through here. And I know a lot of the people on our call are either nonprofits or based in health organizations. But if you go through the report, you're going to have a lot of information that is divided both by gender, identity, and also age, because health tends to be something that's both age and gender oriented. So it's all laid out about the most important priorities as you go through the site, a little bit about health insurance and the impacts of COVID-19. So I know that was going through really quickly, but I really want to point out to everyone that there's a lot of data within this research that we can't go over today, but it's available to you if you want to go and really dig into the report, and you can download it for free on the CMI website. So I want to finish out with just a little bit about outreach to the Black LGBT community. And I think it's really interesting here. We asked the question, do you agree or disagree? And it says companies that support racial equality are more important than ever. And 92% of the participants agreed. And then we say companies that support LGBT equality are more important than ever. And again, 89% agree. So wide agreement here. But then we asked, does corporate America do a good job in outreaching to the overall Black community? Only 6% agree. Then we asked, did corporate America do a good job outreaching to the overall LGBTQ community? A little bit higher, but still pretty poor, 13% agree. And then the final question here, corporate America does a good job outreaching to the Black LGBT community, and only 4% agree with that. And that's sort of a dismal response. And I think, Earl, you're probably in the best shape or best position to respond to this. Why do you think corporate America is doing such a bad job outreaching to the Black LGBTQ community, and what can change here?
Well, because you don't see them at Black LGBTQ events. Most LGBTQ people see corporate America during Pride at a float. And when you look at the float, there's usually, there are not many people of color on the float. Depending on what city you live in, the Pride may not have a lot of people of color attending the event. So if you only see, and occasionally more increasingly, if you watch television, you see more same-sex appearing couples on ads. That's as far as you see, as far as people in corporate America, as far as LGBTQ, and you'll almost never see Black folks in those images. And so if you don't see those images, there's more perception. If you don't see Black folks in those commercials or in those floats, you don't see that Black folks are involved in these organizations. Although many of them do have Black folks in them, you don't see them. And I think what the corporate America has to do is really go beyond their comfort zone. There are other activities that take place in communities, the queer community, besides Pride once a year, and you can spend thousands of dollars decorating your float so your staff can ride through, and no one ever sees you again in the community. I think corporate America has to step beyond their comfort zone and step into the community and work with members of the Black queer community to get more people to give them jobs, give them opportunities, and to invest the LGBT community of color into the work that these corporations are doing.
And I know as a person that actually interacts with many of the Black LGBTQ media and social media influencers, one of the things they'll always say is that there's only two corporate segments that ever want to outreach and advertise, and that tends to be HIV drugs
And alcohol.
and alcohol. Right, those are the only two. So for those corporations that are out there listening to this webinar, I just really want to stress that this is a whole segment of the LGBT community with its own media and its own organizations that is not getting your support whatsoever. They're just not seeing you.
And who has jobs, who are educated and have jobs that are educated. We've listed all the, I think sometimes we look at these surveys and look at things and we see negative numbers, but there are lots of positive numbers. The resiliency of our community is educated, we have jobs, we are participating, we're spiritual. There's so many positive parts of this survey that can lift our community up if corporate America would look through it with different lens, and they're always looking at things. We're a resilient community and we're deserving of support, and we spend money and we make money. And so just reaching out to a segment of the population you're not normally doing so is not good business. Smart business, especially in the world of COVID-19, anyone who has money is eligible for any product that's being sold. And I think corporate America has to step beyond its comfort zone and to reach out to parts of communities that they're not used to doing so, and be willing to partnering with the Black queer community.
And I would just add, and I am going to caveat this by saying this is my opinion. I am not representing HRC when I say this, but I do think we have to think about the ways that those engagements look, in ways that folks sort of receive them as, oh, this is a marketing opportunity, this is a business opportunity, we're mining a new business market. The number of sort of anecdotal comments I hear about all of the folks who are on the bandwagon for LGBTQ, like for Pride Month, et cetera, and marketing and promoting Pride products to make money. And then folks say that they don't see the investment of these corporations in our communities the other 11 months of the year. And I think that would be the same, similarly when we're thinking about Black community and the intersections of both. So I think, folks are really savvy and they know when they are being sort of sold to versus invested in. And I think that we have to be really mindful of, as we're developing strategies and as we're doing outreach, that it can't just be around kind of building our market share, but really about investing in and having a presence in community that is lasting.
And to follow up with what Nicole's saying, and that goes into this next slide, is what types of initiatives should companies do to better understand the Black LGBT community? The number one thing that people said is that, first of all, listen and attempt to truly understand the community. So it's not about, at first, advertising or maybe even sponsoring certain types of events. It's about really trying to understand the community and then authentically outreaching to the community. Any other comments about this, about how to more appropriately outreach to the Black LGBTQ community?
When I was looking at this, I definitely, I agree with all of that. I think the thing that sometimes companies miss is they do conduct these diversity and sensitivity trainings, but then what? And I think we saw this really, after everything that was happening around racial injustice, where all these companies were saying, hey, we're gonna have everybody in the organization do these trainings. We're gonna, throw out these advertising, but then there was no follow-up. And so for those of us in the community that are Black, LGBTQ, again, it's kind of like Nicole said, it's just like you showed up at Pride. There's no follow-up. I think the other thing that, along with advertise, I think representation matters, and I say that over and over again. And, for myself as a queer Black woman, when I'm looking at advertising, I want to see women that look like me, and my partner, and I just think that sometimes they get it wrong. I'm gonna leave it at that.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that, and I see in the chat that, Billy is, barely able to stay in the seat. He is very exercised, saying yes and right on point, Earl. And he also mentioned looking to Target for best practices for engaging with and investing in communities. I'm sure there are other companies that are streaming in that, are doing well in some other ways. But, since Billy brought up Target, it made me think about when I saw Target's activation at Afropunk in New York. And, keep in mind, Afropunk is in August. I think there are a lot of brands very similarly that will show up big during Black History Month in February, but will go dark the other 11 months out of the year, right? And so it underscores the points that Nicole and Earl and Cassandra had made around consistency, and being intentional with that engagement and really doing that listening. Let me tell you, I've never seen Target paint their logo Black until I went to Afropunk. I mean, that is how committed they were. Most brands would never alter their logo in showing up at an activation anywhere, but they really put a lot of thought and intention to that. And so I just wanted to lift that up as an example.
I just think then the alignment's really important. Then when we align our policies for our employees, our practices, the way we're engaged in our community, the way we show up. And, particularly during the uprisings, we saw a lot of corporations that were put on blast because they were saying the right things in the media, and their employees were coming out and saying, that's not what's happening behind the scenes. This is not what my experience is working at this corporation or working at this company. And I think we have to be really careful about what becomes our virtue signaling. And I think there's a lot of pressure for organizations to make statements in the moment. But there has to be the same interrogation behind the scenes around how are all of the other ways that we're showing up in alignment with what we're saying externally, because again, folks know.
That includes, can I just throw that? That includes minimum wage, how much you're paying your people, what kind of benefits you're paying your people, how you're recruiting your people. It's more, who wants a company that is willing to invest in an organization, but you're paying your people $10 an hour. You're not even paying them like a decent living wage. I mean, these are things we have to hold companies accountable to as well.
Yeah, and I see in the chat that Billy says, and it starts with who's at the table. The companies have to start with representation in their decision-making capacities, right? And so it's not just representation on the screen or on the flyer in the commercial, but it's the folks that are making the decisions. And I can say that right here, Cassandra is the chair of AARP's LGBTQ Employee Resource Group. I'm the incoming chair of our African American Employee Resource Group. That says something. That Black queer people, can represent in that way within an organization that is working every day to be more and more of an ally organization with our communities.
And this also, I think this is the last slide, just to say that, there are a lot of ways you can engage with the LGBT community. As I said earlier, I think the first thing to do is to truly understand the community. You need to support federal and state and local non-discrimination policies. That's really important. Deal within your own internal discrimination and own policies, conducting diversity and training, and all that becomes really, really important to authentically outreaching to the LGBT community. But when your time to outreach, there are really great resources within the LGBT community that are very popular within the community. So there are websites and publications that are specific for the Black LGBT community. There's Black Pride, there's other Black events that are very specific for the community. And also to understand that if you go to a more Gen Pop Black event, that LGBT people are going to that event too. And that's another opportunity to engage within the community. So to finish up, as I think we're ending, I just want to finish up and say thank you to everyone. Nii-Quartelai, you may have a couple more questions, but I'm going to let you finish up this whole topic. I think 90 minutes was probably too little to go over even half the number of slides that are in this particular research report. So please download the research report from our website, and I'll let Nii-Quartelai finish everything up.
This has been time well spent. Time well spent. Thank you, David. Thank you, Earl. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Thomas. And thanks to everybody who has spent the past 90 minutes or so with us. We hope that you will geek out along with us and read through this report. There are so many marvelous insights that I promise you will help to power your organization forward, even in these turbulent times. There are no further questions in the chat, just all high praise from folks that have attended. They say it's been an honor and a privilege, and I couldn't agree more.
And thank you to the panel for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
Wow.